My name is Harper Bennett. 10 years ago, I was sleeping in my car. 23 years old. No job, no apartment, no savings, and nowhere to go. My parents looked me in the eye and said, "We can't help you." Then my aunt opened her front door. She gave me a blanket, a pillow, and a place to sleep in her unfinished basement. 10 years later, my parents sat across a crowded room and watched me hand that same aunt the keys to a house. And for the first time in their lives, they realized exactly what they had thrown away. The worst day of my life started with a phone call. My landlord, 3 months behind on rent. No extensions left. No favors left. Nothing left. By sunset, everything I owned was in my car. I wish that had been the worst part. I drove straight to my parents' house, because that's what people do. Or at least, what I thought people did. Family helps family, right? I sat at their kitchen table, crying, terrified, and asked for help. My mother, Linda, sighed heavily. Not sad, annoyed, interesting. Then she said, "Harper, you're 23. As if age somehow creates housing." I stared at her, waiting for the rest. The help never came. My father, Carl, nodded. "Maybe this will teach responsibility. Because losing housing isn't a lesson, it's a crisis." But somehow, they spoke about my homelessness like a motivational seminar. That was my first warning. Then my older brother Ethan walked in. Golden child. Future business owner. Family favorite. He looked at my packed car outside. Then laughed. Actually laughed, and said, "Guess adulthood finally caught up." The room laughed with him. Even Mom. I wasn't asking for money. Not really. Just a couch. A few weeks. Time to recover. Dad shook his head. No room. Because they had 3 empty bedrooms. 3. And somehow, no room. 20 minutes later, I was back in my car. Crying. Shaking. Humiliated. Then my phone rang. Unknown number. I almost ignored it. Thank God I didn't. Because it changed everything. The voice said, "Harper?" My Aunt Rachel. Dad's younger sister. I hadn't spoken to her in months. Then she said, "I heard what happened." Silence. Then, "Come here. That's all. Just come here. If someone helped you when nobody else would, comment, 'I'll never forget.'" Rachel lived 40 minutes away. Small house, modest neighborhood, nothing fancy. She opened the door before I even knocked, then handed me a blanket and said, "Basement's cold." I started crying immediately. Because kindness feels different after rejection. The basement wasn't finished. Concrete floor, old storage shelves, water heater, 1 cot. That's it. But that cot felt like a palace. Because someone chose me, and I didn't know it yet. But that decision would change both our lives forever. The next morning, Aunt Rachel sat across from me at her kitchen table. Coffee, toast, legal pad. Then she said, "You're staying here." I blinked. "What?" She shrugged. "Until you're stable." Just like that. No conditions, no lectures, no humiliation. I wasn't used to that. Rachel worked nights at a medical billing company. Nothing glamorous, but she knew everyone. By lunch, she had printed job listings, highlighted them, added notes, phone numbers, contacts. Because my parents had offered advice, Rachel offered solutions. Huge difference. Then my brother texted, "Hope you're figuring things out." Not, "Where are you staying?" Not, "Are you okay?" Just vague superiority. Then, "Dad says tough love works." I stared at the screen, because apparently my homelessness had become a family philosophy. 3 days later, I landed an interview. Entry-level office assistant. Nothing special. I almost didn't go. Rachel practically pushed me out the door. Then she said, "You don't need confidence." Pause. "You need momentum." That sentence stayed with me for years. Every night Rachel checked on me, not dramatically, just quietly. One evening, she handed me a notebook. Write goals. Simple gift. Huge impact. Because hopeless people stop planning. And Rachel refused to let me stay hopeless. 2 weeks later, Mom called. Unexpected. I answered. Big mistake. She didn't ask about my job search. Didn't ask about my housing. Instead, she said, "Don't get too comfortable over there." Because somehow, even my survival irritated her. Rachel invited me to Sunday dinner. Just us. Pasta, garlic bread, cheap wine. Halfway through, she admitted something. Dad called her. The day she took me in. Because Dad never called anyone for me. Ever. What did he say? Rachel laughed. Dark laugh. Then, he said not to enable you. I froze. Not help me, not check on me, not protect me, prevent help. That changed everything. If someone tried to stop others from helping you, comment, "I see you now." Rachel leaned back, then said, "You know why your father dislikes me?" I shook my head. Then she smiled sadly. Because I never agree with him. Old family dynamics started making sense. The outsider wasn't just me, it was Rachel too. 3 weeks later, I got the job. Tiny office, tiny paycheck, huge victory. I rushed home excited. Rachel hugged me, actually hugged me. Then she cried. And that's when I realized something. She believed in me more than my parents ever had. I didn't know it yet, but they were going to regret that. 6 months later, I got promoted. Not a huge promotion, not life-changing, but enough. Enough to start saving. Enough to stop panicking every time my phone rang. I ran home excited. Rachel baked a cake. Nobody had ever celebrated my promotions before. That mattered. A lot. Then my parents showed up. Unexpected. Because they hadn't checked on me once during homelessness. They wanted lunch. Mom smiled. Dad acted proud. And I immediately knew something was wrong. I was right. Of course I was right. Within 10 minutes, Ethan's name appeared. Again. Always Ethan. Dad sighed. Ethan is starting a business. There it was. The real reason for the visit. Not me. Never me. Mom smiled nervously. We thought maybe you'd contribute. I almost laughed. 3 months earlier, I was homeless. Now they wanted investment capital. Family logic is fascinating sometimes, especially when favoritism is involved. Then Rachel entered the kitchen. Perfect timing. She immediately understood the situation. One glance. That's all it took. Then she asked, "How much are they asking for?" Silence. Beautiful silence. My parents looked embarrassed. Dad stood up. Too quickly. Bad sign. This is family business. Family business. Funny phrase, because homelessness apparently wasn't family business, but Ethan's startup was. That contradiction landed hard, and Rachel noticed. Then Ethan finally said it. $25,000. I almost choked, especially from people who refused me a couch. I looked around the room. Nobody seemed embarrassed except Rachel. That told me everything. I smiled politely, then said, "No." One word. Simple. Powerful. The room froze. Because for the first time, I wasn't the desperate one. And they weren't prepared for that. If someone ignored your struggle but expected help once you succeeded, comment, "Not today." Mom got emotional immediately. Then she said something interesting. "We helped you too." I blinked. Because no, they hadn't. Not even close. Then I realized something. She genuinely believed that, which was somehow worse. After they left, Rachel sat quietly, thinking. Then she said, "There's something I never told you." Because Rachel rarely kept secrets. I looked at her. Then she took a deep breath. The story got much bigger than homelessness. Rachel stared into her coffee for a long moment, then finally said, "Your father came here after you moved in." I froze. Because Dad never mentioned that. Not once. And judging by Rachel's face, there was a reason. What did he want? Rachel laughed softly. Not happy, not amused, disappointed. Then, he wanted me to kick you out. The room went silent. Even the refrigerator suddenly sounded loud. Because surely not. I was wrong. Rachel shook her head. He said you'd never learn responsibility if someone rescued you. Funny how that philosophy only applied to me. Not Ethan. Never Ethan. Because every time Ethan failed, someone wrote a check. A lifetime of favoritism snapped into focus. Rachel opened an old drawer, then handed me a folder. Because apparently this story came with evidence. Inside, a copy of a check. Dad's signature. Amount, $40,000. Payable to Ethan, 10 years earlier. The same month I became homeless. I stared at the date. Again. Then again. Because I recognized it. That was the exact month Dad told me, we can't afford to help. Because apparently they could afford help. Just not for me. That changed everything. Rachel handed me another page. Then another. Then another. Ethan. 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 Every few years. Business losses. Credit card debt. Car loan issues. Interesting. The self-made son had quite a support system. His success looked very different. Then Rachel said something unexpected. The house they're living in? I looked up. She nodded. Your grandparents helped buy it. Another layer. Another secret. Another piece of the family mythology falling apart. Because apparently nobody in my family was self-made. Except maybe Rachel. Then Rachel pulled out an envelope. Old. Yellowed. My grandmother's handwriting. I froze. Grandma died years earlier. Rachel smiled sadly. She asked me to keep this. Because now my heart was racing. And I had no idea why. If the family story started falling apart the moment documents appeared, subscribe and comment, show the receipts. I opened the letter carefully, then read one sentence. And everything changed. Rachel always takes care of the people we overlook. I stopped breathing, because Grandma saw it. Years before I did. The favoritism, the pattern, the damage. She saw all of it. 10 years passed. My career exploded. Promotions, investments, business ownership, stability. The kind of stability I once thought was impossible. Then one day, I planned a family gathering. Everyone came, including my parents, and they had absolutely no idea why. Nobody knew the real reason for the gathering. Not Mom, not Dad, definitely not Ethan. They thought it was a celebration dinner, career milestone, business success, normal family event. Because sometimes the best surprises aren't announced, they're revealed. Slowly, at exactly the right moment. Rachel arrived last. Typical Rachel. Simple dress. Same warm smile. No idea what was coming. She hugged me, asked if I needed help setting up. Even after 10 years. That never changed. Helping people was just who she was. I got emotional. Halfway through dinner, Ethan stood up. Of course he did. Ethan loved speeches. Then he raised a glass. Here's to Harper finally making something of herself. Because hidden inside it was the assumption I'd once been nothing. The room laughed. I smiled. Because tonight wasn't about Ethan. Then Mom added, we always knew she'd figure it out. Because no, they didn't. Not even close. The people who believe in you don't leave you homeless. The people who believe in you don't try to stop others from helping. I felt completely calm. Then I stood up, walked to the corner, and carried over a small wooden box. Inside sat a single key, silver ribbon. Simple. Nothing flashy. Everyone looked confused, especially Rachel. Good. That was the point. I handed her the box. She laughed nervously. What is this? Then she opened it. Silence. Pure silence. She stared at the key. Then at me. then back at the key, and whispered, "No." The room froze. I smiled, then finally said the words I'd waited 10 years to say. "The house is yours." Silence. Rachel's eyes filled immediately. Mom stopped breathing. Dad looked stunned. Ethan looked confused. I continued. "You gave me a place to live when nobody else would." Pause. "You gave me a future." Nobody in the room could look away. Rachel started crying. Real tears. The kind you can't fake. Then she whispered, "Harper." I shook my head. "No." Pause. "You saved me." Then I turned toward my parents. Not angry. Not bitter. Just honest. The only reason I could buy that house is because she refused to let me fail. And finally, the room understood. If someone changed your life with one act of kindness, subscribe and comment I never forgot. Dad looked down at his plate for a long time, then quietly said, "We made mistakes. Not denial, not excuses, just truth. Late truth, but truth." Mom started crying. They were watching the results of their own choices, in real time. After dinner, Rachel and I stood outside together, holding the keys, looking at the sunset. She asked, "Why me?" I smiled, then answered honestly, "Because 10 years ago, when I had absolutely nothing." Pause. "You treated me like I was worth something." She cried again. I almost did too. My parents watched from the window, silent, regretful, powerless. And maybe that was the real revenge. Not the house, not the money, not the success. The fact that the person who believed in me when I was sleeping in a basement was the person standing beside me when I finally made it. 10 years earlier, my parents closed their door. My aunt opened hers. And in the end, that one decision changed both our lives.